Several years ago, when I first began my coursework in spiritual direction from the Hayden Institute, our class was divided into small groups of 12 people, and each group began our work with delivering what we called our spiritual autobiographies. Each of us was given 30 minutes to share with the group how we had seen the sacred moving through our lives, throughout our lifetimes. And they asked us to begin by focusing on 5 to 7 spiritual milestones, reflecting on how these experiences changed our theological and spiritual understanding, how our faith communities had affected those milestones, what gave us life, fed our souls at that particular moment, and what our souls were still reaching for. The stories that people told were all incredibly moving. And what I found interesting and sad as a minister was that so many of these milestones happened in spite of, in conflict with, or even harshly punished by the religious institutions that these people had been a part of when those milestones occurred. Some of those institutions had caused real trauma for those beautiful people in their past. There's a term, religious trauma syndrome, or RTS, that was first coined in 2011 by psychologist Marlene Winell. Though the phenomenon was recognized before that, she was the one that gave RTS its name. RTS begins in toxic religious environments centered on 2 basic narratives. The first of which is, you are not okay. And the second of which is, you are not safe. And while chronically living within one of these narratives can be damaging, it's also been found that leaving those religious institutions can also be very traumatic events. I think it's important to recognize that there is a need for this label, because this kind of abuse causes symptoms that can last a lifetime, causing shame, isolation, and a narrowing of the religious language that we are comfortable using. And while I've never experienced anything as traumatic that I could identify as RTS, I did have some events in my upbringing that did cause me some religious harm. The first of which happened when I was very, very small. I'm not even sure I was in elementary school yet. And I had a Sunday school teacher who used a lot of fire and brimstone language, probably to keep us in our seats during our lessons. But I went through several months of having horrible nightmares. We lived on a farm, and that winter we were hatching baby chicks in a shed that was outside my bedroom window. And at night my parents would turn on the heating lights, which were red, and it would cast a red glow across my bedroom wall. And I was convinced that God had set the world on fire and was coming in his chariot to pick me up and take me somewhere that was very unpleasant. And it was years before I could explain to my parents what these night terrors had been about. And then years later, this was a much milder form of angst, but it occurred during my catechism classes at St. Peter's Lutheran Church in rural Minnesota, when the pastor would ask us questions out of the catechism. And we had to reiterate those answers from the catechism word for word. And if we misplaced one word, he would point and say, "Wrong," and turn his back and ask a question to another student on the other side of the room. Carl Jung often wrote about what he called archetypal projection, which makes those kinds of experiences especially harmful. It's an unconscious mechanism which establishes a link between a religious leader and the holy mystery of life. And so when that pastor turned his back on us, it was as if God herself was turning her back. Jung notes that in some classical spiritual apprenticeships, the student is actually encouraged to meditate on the teacher as the image of God, merge with him or her, and give over their own spiritual authority and control. And while this process can relieve existential uncertainty, because we can believe that we are in the presence of someone who's carrying the whole truth, projecting this much light onto a mortal person can lead to horrible heartbreak. Whether the teacher is a priest, a pastor, a rabbi, a guru, if and when that teacher acts out in emotional, physical, or financial abuse, the believer will feel betrayed, disillusioned, and lost. If you were to write a spiritual autobiography, would there be these kinds of experiences in your life? I think many Unitarian Universalists would say yes, that they had been harmed in some way. But whether we have met this kind of darkness on our paths, spiritual repair is an area that I would like to explore this morning. I remember a distinct moment when I started some of this spiritual repair work for myself. At the time, I was done with Christianity. I thought it's only full of constrictions. But then I happened to go to a lecture at Duke by a Christian feminist theologian, and I thought, okay, what she's talking about, I could actually wrap my mind around, and maybe there is something here that I need to reclaim for myself. And at the time, my spirituality, my spiritual community was a circle of women who met twice a month, once on the full moon and once on the new moon. And I loved that group. But one evening as we met, I was sharing with them how I was thinking about reclaiming some of my Christian roots. And one woman said, I don't know if you would be welcomed back here if you do that. And I watched several other women nod in agreement. And now I can recognize that that response was most likely due to some pretty heavy religious trauma. But at the time, I was just really hurt. But fortunately, one of the women said, why don't you try Unitarian Universalism? And so I did. And I found that this movement, this particular faith community, is a place where you will be welcomed in even when the pagans have decided you're a heretic. As I've moved into the fourth quarter of my life, I find it increasingly important to reflect on what I believe about the divine, what I most cherish, and what I highly value. And I have been so grateful to Unitarian Universalism for offering that space within which to do that work, that repair, that spiritual repair work, to reflect on my past beliefs and to revise those beliefs when they no longer work for me. If I were to claim a theological model, and I'm a little suspicious of any theological models these days, but if I were to claim one, it would be most closely aligned with process theology, which says in part that God delights in our joy and in our becoming whole people, that she will support and sustain us on that journey whenever we are open to it, that we always have permission to create an image of the holy that is unique to our journey. And he will not turn his back on us. The work of spiritual repair begins when we can look at our past religious experiences and grieve the ways in which we have been harmed and what we have lost as a result of that harm. When we can tend to that younger self that didn't know any better than to conflate harmful teachings and fallible human beings with what they were trying to point toward. After this tending and this grieving, we might consider coming to terms with that experience by looking at it in a larger frame. Maybe this experience of looking back over what happened to us can lead to reconciliation, or, at least make us realize that those religious figures from our past were just human beings. Maybe we can begin to forgive them, and maybe we can begin to forgive ourselves for feeling shame about what happened. Each one of us carries a whole bag of emotional stuff that drags behind us, filled with memories of human beings that have betrayed us, who have wounded us, who have broken our hearts in some way. Because being a human being is synonymous with being imperfect. We know this in our heads, but it's really hard to feel it in our hearts. If this has occurred to you, if your wounds are because of a faith community or a person within a faith community, I encourage you to begin thinking about some spiritual repair. Otherwise, it's always going to cast a shadow. And that shadow means it limits it limits the language you're comfortable with. It limits the spiritual breadth of your life. It creates a narrow band of what you allow yourself to feel. You might begin spiritual repair by doing this. Take a few breaths. And when your mind is quiet, choose one particular faith-based wound that you may have suffered. It might have involved something you heard from a friend, or a parent, or a pastor, or a teacher. And reflect in your mind that story that you've always told yourself, that you were a victim, you were innocent, you were hurt, you were powerless to prevent what happened. And because you feel that you were harmed, you have to blame him or her. You have to hold that grudge, not only toward that person, but toward the light that they were trying to claim, to represent. And now, set this painful moment in the context of what followed. How did your life direction change from this event? What doors opened and closed for you? What people appeared and what people disappeared? What did you learn about yourself and your ability to overcome, to be resilient? Did you begin looking for a deeper connection to something larger than yourself beyond the doctrinal teachings? Did you, or can you now begin to turn that betrayal into a kind of initiation? Eventually, when you can reframe the hurtful event in this way, and this is not just for spiritual repair, but all kinds of life repairs, you may be able to see that the person who betrayed you also initiated you out of your naivete, out of an understanding that was limited. You may be able to forgive, which doesn't necessarily mean that you need to bring that person back into your life or think that what they had done was right. It simply means you are deciding not to drag that particular thing with you in your bag anymore. There is no image of the holy that has not been corrupted by human imperfection. And so it is in the beauty and breadth of our experiences and our images that we can see most clearly the path to the kingdom. Much as the kingdom of Paeonia in our story earlier this morning, we saw that the diversity of the flowers is what brought the kingdom its beauty. We should also seek out places where no proclamations are read and no royal weed removers are ventured to censor our spiritual truths. What would you include in your spiritual autobiography? What stories would you tell? What baggage do you need to release yourself from? Each of us needs to cultivate a connection to our own inner wisdom through a growing awareness of our thoughts, our feelings, our intuitions, images, and actions. If in the past that process has been shut down for you by a religious community, I pray that you can begin to release it yourself from that shadow. May it be so, and blessed be.